On the quiet streets of Oak Ridge, a black SUV comes to a stop. Inside sits four-star General Regina Walker, a woman who has faced battlefields and never been defeated. But tonight, in her own hometown, she is about to confront an enemy far more dangerous, one that hides behind badges and the illusion of law. What begins as a routine traffic stop suddenly spirals into a brutal assault as two local officers drag her from her car with merciless force. What they don't realize is that the woman they are trying to break will soon bring their entire corrupt empire crashing down. If this moment felt intense, prepare yourself, because what comes next is darker, more dangerous, and far more powerful than anything you've seen so far. Subscribe to Black Battles and hit the bell icon so you never miss our latest powerful stories. The road into Oak Ridge stretched endlessly beneath the dim glow of the evening sun. Regina Walker sat behind the wheel of her black SUV, the silence inside almost unbearable. She had faced countless missions overseas, led soldiers into battles where survival was never guaranteed, and had medals pinned to her chest for bravery under fire. Yet tonight, as she approached the town of her childhood, a heavy weight pressed down on her heart. She wasn't returning as a war hero or a four-star general. She was returning as a daughter, grieving her mother's passing. The streets felt frozen in time, lined with the same old storefronts and rusting signs that had watched her grow up. But beneath that familiarity lingered an unshakable tension. Oak Ridge had always been divided by invisible lines, lines of race, power, and silence. Regina knew those lines had not faded. If anything, they had deepened over the years. She could sense the eyes of strangers watching as her SUV rolled through town, as though her presence was a disruption to the quiet facade the town worked so hard to maintain. She was only a few miles from her aunt's house when flashing red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened. Regina slowed and pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down her window with calm precision. This was routine, she told herself. She had nothing to fear. Yet something about the way the cruiser angled aggressively behind her and the quick, heavy footsteps approaching made her instincts flare. Two officers approached, Bradley Henson and Kyle Mercer, men she didn't recognize but whose reputations were well known in Oak Ridge. Both carried themselves not with the professionalism of law enforcement, but with the arrogance of predators who knew the rules would always bend in their favor. "License and registration," Henson barked, his tone sharp, dismissive, already dripping with hostility. Regina complied, her movements slow and deliberate. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked evenly, her voice calm, the same tone she used when addressing soldiers under pressure. Mercer circled the SUV like a vulture, his flashlight beam cutting across the interior, lingering far too long on her uniform jacket draped over the passenger seat. His smirk was barely concealed. "What's this? You playing soldier?" he mocked. Regina met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm a U.S. Army general." For a brief moment there was silence, then laughter. "Well, General," Henson sneered, leaning closer, "around here that doesn't mean a thing." The next moments unfolded with startling speed. Mercer yanked open the door, pulling Regina out without warning. She stumbled, but held her ground, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. They shoved her against the SUV, rough and deliberate, searching her as though she were a common criminal. A couple of cars slowed as they passed, but no one stopped. Oak Ridge had long ago learned to look away. Inside, anger burned hot in Regina's chest, but she forced her breathing steady. She had faced enemies more dangerous than these men. Yet she knew the danger here was not just in their hands, but in the system that allowed them to act without fear of consequence. And as the cold steel of handcuffs locked around her wrists, one thought pulsed through her mind. Oak Ridge had not changed, but she had. This time, she wasn't here to bow her head and walk away. This time, she would fight back. The night air in Oak Ridge felt heavier than ever as Regina sat in the holding cell, the metallic echo of the bars clanging shut still ringing in her ears. Her wrists throbbed from the cuffs, her body stiff from the officer's unnecessary roughness. She had been through war zones, ambushes, and sleepless nights under enemy fire, but this This humiliation on her hometown soil felt sharper than any bullet. Hours dragged on before her release. No charges were filed, no explanations given. The paperwork had simply gone missing, and with a mocking smile, Officer Henson shoved her belongings back at her, whispering low enough for only her to hear, "Watch yourself, General. This town doesn't need outsiders stirring trouble." Regina walked out of the precinct with her jaw set, the neon buzz of the flickering light above the door, a cruel reminder of how broken Oak Ridge remained. She had come here for her mother's funeral, to lay her to rest in peace. But already the town was pulling her into its shadows. Her aunt, Margaret Walker, was waiting for her outside, bundled in a worn shawl, eyes filled with both relief and sorrow. "I told you, Regina," she said softly, wrapping her arms around her niece. "This town doesn't forgive, and it never forgets." At Margaret's house, the air smelled faintly of rosemary and cedar, a comforting contrast to the stench of the jail cell. Yet even in that comfort, Regina couldn't rest. She replayed every second of the stop, every sneer on Henson's face, every shove from Mercer. Something was off. They weren't just power-hungry officers flexing their authority. There had been a cruel intention behind their actions. Something deeper, something calculated. The next morning, as the sun broke through the blinds, Regina sat with her aunt over black coffee. Margaret spoke quietly, as if the walls themselves were listening. "It's been getting worse. People disappearing into the system, kids locked up for things they didn't do, families too scared to speak out. Everyone knows what's happening, but no one dares to say it." Regina leaned forward, her voice steady but urgent. "Who's behind it?" Margaret hesitated, eyes flickering with fear. "The police, the mayor, and others, bigger than them. They've turned Oak Ridge into a trap. The prisons make money off everybody they lock away, and the more silence they buy, the stronger they get." The words cut deep, confirming what Regina had begun to suspect. Oak Ridge wasn't just broken, it was being fed into a machine. Later that day, Regina crossed paths with two people who would soon become allies. The first was Daniel Cross, a young attorney fresh out of law school, brimming with determination but weighed down by frustration. "I've filed motions, appeals, everything I can," he told her, "but cases vanish. Evidence disappears. Judges look the other way." The second was Claire Johnson, a local journalist whose notebook was filled with stories she could never publish. "The truth is here," she whispered, tapping the pages, "but no one will risk printing it. The town's paper is owned by the same people running the show." As Regina listened, something inside her shifted. This was no longer just about her mother's funeral, nor even about her own dignity. This was about Oak Ridge itself, about the countless voices silenced and lives destroyed. She realized then that her return wasn't a coincidence. It was fate. And if Oak Ridge thought she would leave quietly, they had gravely underestimated her. Regina spent the following days walking Oak Ridge's streets with the eyes of both an outsider and a soldier. Every corner, every glance, every whispered conversation carried a weight she couldn't ignore. It wasn't paranoia. Her instincts, sharpened by decades in the army, told her she was being watched. Sometimes it was a car idling too long at the curb, other times the same figure reappearing on different blocks. Oak Ridge wasn't just unfriendly, it was dangerous. At night, Regina sat at her Aunt Margaret's kitchen table with Claire Johnson, the journalist, and Daniel Cross, the attorney. The three of them spread out documents, faded arrest records, and yellowed newspaper clippings. Regina listened as Claire pieced together a grim puzzle, dozens of arrests with no proper warrants, trials that never reached the courtroom, and young men and women funneled into prisons with alarming speed. "It's a pipeline," Claire explained, her finger tracing a line across her notes. "The police round them up. The judges look the other way, and the prison companies profit. Everybody means money. Oak Ridge is feeding its own children into the system," Daniel added bitterly. "And once they're in, they disappear. Families can't get answers. Files go missing. If you push too hard, you're threatened. Or worse." The evidence was staggering, but to Regina, what stood out wasn't just the pattern, it was the silence. Oak Ridge had been living under this weight for years, maybe decades, yet almost no one had spoken out. Fear had choked the town into submission. That silence was broken one evening when Regina and Margaret visited a neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, whose grandson had been taken 2 years prior. The woman's hands trembled as she spoke, clutching a framed photo of the boy. "He was 16, she whispered. "Picked up for loitering outside the grocery store. They said he resisted arrest, but I know my boy. We never saw him again. They told me he was transferred, but no one will say where. He's gone, General. Just gone!" Regina's chest tightened. She had seen families grieve on foreign soil, but to hear this pain in her hometown cut deeper. It confirmed the horror she already suspected. Oak Ridge was eating its own children, and no one was stopping it. That night, as Regina drove home, headlights flared in her rearview mirror. A truck tailed her for miles, too close, its engine growling with menace. She recognized the tactic. It was intimidation, a warning. She refused to pull over. Instead, she slowed, forcing the truck to roar past her in frustration. As it did, she caught a glimpse of the driver, Officer Mercer, his smirk illuminated by the passing lights. Regina gripped the steering wheel, her jaw tight. This wasn't just about harassment anymore. They knew she was digging. And they were sending a message. Back at the house, she found a note slid under the door. The handwriting was messy, hurried, but the words chilled her. "Leave Oak Ridge, or you won't leave at all." Regina folded the note slowly, her expression unreadable. Fear might have been their weapon, but discipline was hers. And instead of retreating, she felt her resolve sharpen. Oak Ridge's corrupt machine had run unchecked for too long. Now she would tear apart its threads one by one. Regina rose before dawn, her body conditioned to military schedules, but this time, the mission was different. Instead of preparing troops for combat, she was preparing to confront a town buried in fear. The note slid under Margaret's door still echoed in her mind. "Leave Oak Ridge or you won't leave at all." For some, it would have been enough to pack up and vanish. But for Regina, it was the spark that lit a fire. At the church on Maple Street, the faint glow of stained glass windows fell across wooden pews. It was here that Regina met with the first group willing to talk. Veterans, retired workers, mothers who had lost sons, and young activists sat in silence as she entered. Their faces were weary, etched with years of intimidation. Yet when Regina looked at them, she saw not defeat, but quiet resilience waiting to be awakened. "Fear has kept Oak Ridge in chains," she began, her voice steady, carrying the authority of a commander but softened by compassion. "But fear loses its power the moment we stand together. They tried to silence me. They tried to silence you. That ends now," the room stirred. A veteran named Harold, who had once served under her in the army, nodded solemnly. "If you say it's time, General, then it's time." One by one, stories began to pour out. A mother wept as she described how her son had been jailed for a crime he didn't commit, only to vanish in the transfer system. A teenager, barely 18, spoke of being harassed by officers every time he walked home from work. An elderly man shared how his nephew's arrest had bankrupted the family with legal fees, only for the charges to be lost in court. Claire, the journalist, scribbled furiously in her notebook, capturing every word. Daniel, the lawyer, promised to archive testimonies and secure sworn affidavits, evidence the courts couldn't easily erase. For the first time in years, the silence was cracking, but cracks invite pressure. Later that evening, as Regina walked back to her SUV, she noticed fresh tire marks on the gravel by the church. Too many, too recent. A warning lingered in the air, invisible but palpable. Whoever controlled Oak Ridge's system already knew she was stirring voices they had worked hard to suppress. Back at Margaret's, Regina stared at the stack of statements collected that night. Each was a wound carved into Oak Ridge's soul, but together they formed something powerful, a weapon of truth. She thought about her mother, about how she had spent her life urging Regina to be strong, to fight for what was right. Perhaps Regina realized her mother's passing had not brought her back just for grief, but for purpose. That night, Regina made a vow. She would not leave Oak Ridge until the voices she heard in that church were heard across the nation, no matter the threats, no matter the cost. In the quiet darkness, the echoes of resistance had finally begun to rise, and Oak Ridge's long silence was breaking. By the end of the week, Oak Ridge was buzzing. Whispers about the church gathering traveled faster than the officials could contain them. For the first time in years, people were speaking openly, on porches, in barber shops, at the grocery store. The silence that had protected the corrupt machine was splintering, and those at the top felt the tremors. The response was swift. The mayor, Robert Kane, called a press conference outside City Hall. Flanked by Chief Raymond Holt and officers Bradley Henson and Kyle Mercer, he painted Regina as a dangerous outsider. "She's stirring unrest," Kane declared into the cameras. Oak Ridge is a peaceful town, but agitators seek to destroy that peace with false stories and reckless accusations. The smear campaign had begun. Local papers, owned by Kane's allies, ran headlines the next morning questioning Regina's credibility. Old photos from her deployments were twisted into misleading captions. One article suggested she was mentally unstable from combat stress. Another hinted she had been disgraced by the military. Regina read the papers in silence, jaw clenched, while Margaret shook her head. "They're trying to break you before you can break them," her aunt murmured. The attacks didn't stop at words. Daniel, the young attorney, received a summons for fabricated charges, tampering with evidence in a case he never touched. Claire's car was vandalized, tires slashed in broad daylight. Even Harold, the veteran, found himself harassed by officers who showed up at his home with bogus noise complaints. The message was clear. Anyone who stood with Regina would pay. One night, Regina returned to find her SUV's windshield shattered, glass littered across the driveway. A spray-painted message glared at her from the hood. "Leave now!" Margaret urged caution, her eyes full of fear. "They're escalating, Regina. If you push too hard, they'll try to destroy you completely." Regina stared at the vandalized car, then at the stack of testimonies laid out across Margaret's dining table. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with resolve. "They already started a war. I'm not backing down." That same evening, she called Claire and Daniel. "We're going to take this further," Regina said. "The stories we've collected, they won't stay buried. If Oak Ridge won't listen, Washington will." Claire's voice wavered, but only for a moment. "Then we need to go public, bigger than local news. I have contacts in regional media. Once this spreads, they can't silence it. But even as plans took shape, danger loomed closer. Unknown cars circled Margaret's block. Phone lines clicked with obvious surveillance. Regina noticed men in plain clothes lingering outside her mother's gravesite. It was no longer intimidation. It was war in the shadows. And though Oak Ridge's leaders believed they could smear her, threaten her, and crush her allies, they had made a critical mistake. They had underestimated the endurance of a soldier who had spent her life surviving battles far worse than theirs. The power in Oak Ridge had struck back, but Regina was preparing to strike harder. The air in Oak Ridge grew heavy as Sunday approached. The small church on Maple Street, once a quiet sanctuary for hymns and prayer, had become the heartbeat of the town's resistance. Its walls had absorbed whispered confessions of injustice, and now it was ready to echo with the voices of the silenced. Inside, pews filled faster than the ushers could guide. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, eyes alert, faces tense. The old wooden floors creaked under the weight of people who, for years, had lived with fear pressing down on their necks. But tonight was different. Tonight they came not to worship in silence, but to speak in defiance. Regina stood near the altar, her posture unshaken, though her heart raced. She had faced battlefields, but this gathering felt more dangerous than any combat zone. Here, every voice was a target. Every testimony carried a risk. Yet, looking at the sea of expectant eyes, she knew retreat was no longer possible. Claire stepped up first. Her hands trembled as she held a folder of police reports she had collected. She spoke of clients intimidated into silence, of mothers whose sons were locked up without cause, of neighbors stopped and searched for no reason other than the color of their skin. Each word was heavy, but her voice grew stronger with every sentence. By the end, the congregation erupted in murmurs of agreement and cries of "Enough!" Daniel followed. raising documents that showed forged signatures and hidden legal maneuvers by the town's leadership. "This isn't just corruption," he said firmly. "This is a system designed to keep us powerless. But we have proof, and proof is our weapon." His words lit sparks in the room, the kind that spread into wildfire. Then came Harold, the veteran, leaning on his cane. His voice, though cracked with age, carried authority. "I fought for this country," he said, "and I bled for its promise of freedom. Yet here in Oak Ridge, freedom is rationed like scraps from a table. That ends now." Applause thundered through the church. Some wept openly. Others clapped until their hands stung. For the first time, the people of Oak Ridge saw themselves not as scattered victims, but as a force united. But outside, danger brewed. Unmarked cars lined the street. Officers stood in the shadows, radios crackling, waiting for orders. Kane and Chief Holt had deployed them, hoping to intimidate the crowd, maybe even storm the gathering if it grew too bold. Inside, Regina felt the tension shift. She noticed a man near the back pew whispering into a headset, eyes scanning the room like a hunter marking prey. Her instincts screamed. "They're here," she thought, yet when she stepped forward to speak, her voice did not waver. "They will try to break us," she said, staring straight at the hidden officer. "They will call us liars. They will threaten our families. But tonight proves something greater. They fear us because they know the truth is stronger than their lies." The church erupted, voices rising like thunder. For a moment, Oak Ridge belonged not to its corrupt rulers, but to its people, and outside the officers tightened their grips on batons and radios, waiting. The night was about to explode. The night air around the Maple Street Church was electric, humming with the tension of an unspoken battle. Inside, the congregation still echoed with chants of "Justice! Justice!" But outside, the threat pressed closer. Patrol cars idled at both ends of the street, their headlights casting long, menacing shadows. Officers gripped batons and rifles, waiting for the signal from Chief Holt and Mayor Kane. Regina could feel it. The storm on the horizon was no longer metaphorical. It was here, pressing against the fragile walls of the church. She turned to Claire and Daniel. "If they try to force their way in, we can't scatter. We stand together. This moment is bigger than fear." Both nodded, their faces pale but resolute. Suddenly, the heavy church doors slammed open. A wave of armed officers surged forward, barking orders for everyone to get down. Mothers pulled children close, and elders leaned protectively over the young. Chaos threatened to drown the unity that had just been born. But Regina moved. Her boots struck the floorboards with the same authority she had once commanded on foreign soil. She stepped into the aisle, raised her hands high, and shouted, "Hold your ground! This is a house of truth, not a battlefield." The congregation froze, their fear steadied by her voice. Even the officers hesitated. For the first time, they were not facing scattered citizens. They were facing a united movement led by a woman who had already defied death in the service of her country. Then, from the back, Harold rose with surprising strength, his cane thudding like a drumbeat. "You come here to silence us?" he roared. "Not tonight! Not ever again!" The crowd echoed his words, voices colliding into a thunderous chant. "Not tonight! Not ever again!" the officers faltered. Radios crackled. Somewhere down the line, hesitation crept into their ranks. And in that hesitation, headlights appeared at the far end of the street, black SUVs with tinted windows, marked only by the discreet insignia of the U.S. Department of Justice. Federal agents stepped out, their presence a hammer cracking the brittle shell of local corruption. Kane's plan to crush the gathering had just backfired spectacularly. Inside the church, relief rippled through the crowd, but Regina remained focused. She knew this was not a victory yet. It was only the turning of the tide. By morning, the arrests began. Mayor Kane, Chief Holt, and their closest conspirators were taken into custody, their faces captured on national news. Files uncovered from police archives revealed decades of wrongful arrests, forged evidence, and backroom deals with private prisons. The walls of secrecy that Oak Ridge's leaders had built for years crumbled in days. For the townspeople, it was both vindication and grief. Stories poured out, families torn apart, lives stolen, dreams crushed under fabricated charges. The pain was real, but so was the fire for change. Weeks later, the same church that had nearly become a crime scene transformed into something new, the headquarters for the Walker Justice Foundation. Regina, standing beneath a simple wooden cross, announced its mission: to fight systemic abuse, protect the vulnerable, and ensure Oak Ridge, and towns like it, would never again fall prey to corruption. Claire became the Foundation's lead investigator, Daniel its chief legal mind, and Harold its living symbol of resilience. Veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens signed up to help. What had begun as a moment of defiance grew into a movement of reform. As Regina looked out over the crowd, faces no longer weighed down by silence but lifted with purpose, she felt something stir deep within her. It was not the pride of medals or the authority of rank. It was something greater, the knowledge that her mother's town had been saved, not by one woman, but by a community that finally chose to fight back. That night, walking alone beneath the stars, Regina whispered a promise to herself and to the people she now led. This battle is not over. It has only begun, and as long as I stand, justice will never be silenced. Oak Ridge was no longer the same town where she had been broken on the roadside. It was now the ground where a movement had risen.